Welcome, everyone, to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Perez. I'm the founder and CEO of Epic Project. This is an ongoing conversation about how men can show up in the world in the best version of themselves. And one of the coolest things about this for me personally is I've had the privilege of introducing so many women who have helped me personally. They've helped Epic organizationally figure out what that means to show up as the best version of ourselves as men. And so today is no exception. I have really cool friends and I get to hang out with them here, and it's a privilege to me. So today is Lauren Hersh, who's the founder and CEO of World Without Exploitation. Lauren, welcome. Tell us just a little bit about yourself and about your work. We have a long list of things that we'd like to talk about, but tell us a little bit about yourself first.
Well, first and most importantly, thank you so much for having me, Tom. I am so grateful for you, for your friendship, for your work. Really important always, but now more than ever. So just really deeply grateful for you. My name is Lauren Hersh. I'm the National Director of World Without Exploitation. We're a national coalition designed to combat human trafficking and sexual exploitation. We were created about 8.5 years ago, really looking at the landscape of human trafficking and recognizing that across the country, there was so much good work happening. But for the vast majority of the organizations that worked on this issue, they had two things in common. They were overworked and under-resourced. And so that in really critical times, when we wanted to pull together the work, people, for policy change, legislative change, for these big ticket movement-based work that these organizations felt like, yes, I want to buy in, I want to do this, but we're so under-resourced and so understaffed and so overworked that we just can't do it. And so we believe that World Without Exploitation, that if we could come together, we could create the infrastructure to be really the movement connective tissue, we could be so much more impactful. And so that's just what we did. We started with 5 organizations. To date, we have nearly 200 organizations that we're working together with. And we're working on all sorts of issues. We're working to change policy, shift legislation, elevate survivors, and really bring together the movement to end exploitation. So that's World We, and that's been the bulk of my work over the last 9 years or so. And in my previous life, I was a prosecutor, a New York City prosecutor, and I was the chief of the sex trafficking unit at the Brooklyn DA's office. So a lot of what I do now comes from that time. That's really the bulk of my perspective. I got to see a lot on the ground, in the trenches, and it was really painful work, but really inspiring work. And left me with a really strong belief that response, the prosecution is important, but that prevention is everything. And so a lot of our work at World Without Exploitation is really focused on how can we make sure that we don't end up with more people in the sex trade and having to do a lot more work with people who have long-term trauma as a direct result of exploitation.
Wow. I love that you said prosecution is important, but prevention is everything. That's huge. I have not shared this with you because it's just an idea that has been rattling around my head since we first met virtually, because this is like so many stories, right? We knew each other and were on umpteen calls. But I remember as a college athlete on the football field, when a leader in the middle of a game or in the middle of practice raised their hand and said, hey, I got something to say, or come over here. When that person was a proven leader, everybody huddled up around that person. And you were that, I think in the moment that you and I first met, like you were the one you were on the field, we're in the trenches, and you raised your hand. I know you're not a football player. You're the farthest thing from it. But
I'm not a football player, but football's on a lot in my house, Tom.
I know. So
I see and hear it a lot.
Yeah. So you were like, for me, it was that moment like, okay, here's someone that's leading and we need to show up and pay attention. And so I appreciate the way you did that. And there's definitely a ferocity about you that people respect and respond to. And so I think it was in the middle of COVID, maybe when we first met. I know there was a bunch of legislative stuff going on, and I want to talk about that in a little bit. But you are also a wife and a mom. Tell us a little bit about family life for you.
I mean, I guess it would be obvious to say that my family is the reason that I do this work every day.
Yeah.
I have 2 kids. I have a 17-year-old son and a 14-year-old daughter. And interestingly, Tom, they are the reason that I actually shifted from working as a prosecutor to creating World Without Exploitation. And I'll tell you what I mean. So as a prosecutor, I spent countless hours running out to pull victims out of brothels or out of the arms of pimps. I found myself in these situations where I would run home, I would feed my kids, bathe them, get them to bed, and then I'd run out to a crime scene and I'd pull a 13-year-old out of the arms of a pimp. And then around 5 o'clock in the morning, I would start looking for any police officer who could get me home in time for my kids to wake up.
Wow.
And it was grueling work. It was really just so emotionally taxing. And I was working on this one particular case, and the victim was really young, and she kept relapsing, which is obviously totally normal. She kept breaking away from the cycle of violence with her trafficker, and then something would happen, and she would end up back in the life and back with him. And she had a daughter that was actually my daughter's age at the time. Yeah. And there was so much regression, so that her daughter was being used and dangled as both the carrot and the stick in this trafficking scheme. And her daughter, who was my daughter's age, was experiencing tremendous regression.
Wow.
And was experiencing vicarious trauma. And I felt that at that point, I couldn't continue doing the work that I was doing in the way that I was doing it.
Yeah.
And so when I talk about the fact that my kids are the very reason that I do what I do, they're the reason that I left the DA's office in part. They're the reason that I continue doing this work. And it's not just my daughter, right? A lot of times people are like, oh, it's the girls. But it's also my strong belief that I have an obligation to at least help create a world that I want my son to live in as well. And so it's so much of the work that you do, Tom, I'm so grateful for, because I think particularly in this moment in time, we have to make sure that masculinity is healthy, that we're giving men and especially boys the right foundation, the right tools to be able to go out into the world, to be able to get to a point of equality. And I think we've got a lot of work to do, but I think that we have to do right, not just by our girls, but by our boys as well.
Yeah. Yep. I absolutely believe. And you're right. I think to call that out, that I think that the initial response to exploitation is we always think of the girl. And that makes sense because they're the one in the moment most at risk. But I've come to learn that if you don't also think of the boys that grow up, like you said, the boys that may grow up to become buyers and just perpetuate that cycle all over again, if you don't consider the boys, it's like we're fighting this with one arm tied behind our back.
100%. And also the other piece, which we know and which we just saw in the news with that Abercrombie case, is that boys can also be vulnerable and can also be victims. And so I think that as a culture and even as a movement, I think we've spent a large part of our time talking about women and girls, and it is so important. I cannot emphasize that enough. But we also have to recognize that there are boys who are victimized in exploitation, and we have to name that, and we have to look out for it, and we have to educate on it.
Yeah. The common denominator is the exploiters, whether they're boys or girls, right? Typically it's men. And that's the hard conversation. I want to come back to that. But tell us Tell us a little bit more about World Without Exploitation. It's WWE, but you are not a professional wrestling organization.
And we don't go by WWE
I know.
for that reason. So the short version is World We. When we were actually creating our name back in the day, we were hugely cognizant of that WWE piece of it. It was actually almost for a split second a deal breaker, but we felt that we could frame our organization as a shorthand as World We, but we also loved the title, World Without Exploitation.
Yeah.
We found it hugely aspirational, and that is what we're looking to create, a world without exploitation.
So talk to me a little bit about how you guys are pursuing that vision. I know there's a lot of different things you guys have going on, but how are you moving in that direction?
So I would say we're working in three major buckets, Tom. We're working on the legislative front, and we can kind of talk about what those legislative initiatives look like. Obviously, we're huge advocates of partial decriminalization or the Nordic model or the equality model, but now we're calling it the survivor model. So I'd love to talk about that, which seeks to decriminalize people sold in the sex trade and give them exit strategies and services, but simultaneously hold exploiters accountable for the devastating harm they do. Exploiters including pimps, traffickers, brothel owners, and importantly, sex buyers. So the legislative bucket is a big ticket for us. We're also working to elevate survivor leadership, and we do that in a whole host of ways. We have a survivor training program that we call STAND, Survivor Training Advocacy Networking and Development Program, and I'd love to talk a little bit about that. And then the third bucket is we're working in a lot of different arenas, but we're working very hard to educate the public because we truly believe the more people know, the better they do. Yeah. So those three arenas, legislative and policy, survivor leadership, and education.
Yeah. So let's go there. Let's talk about the legislative and policy thing, because I think that's where our paths first crossed. When there were several around the country, I know there were several different pushes on the legislative front. So what is happening and what are the things that would trigger you guys from engaging in a specific area in a state or maybe a more, well, it's, you pretty much operate at the state or the federal level, correct?
Yeah, we do.
So what's the threshold for...
Sorry.
No, I was just saying, what are the things that the indicators that when they show up, you guys are like, all right, we got to address this. What does that look like?
So we look to a couple of different things when we're deciding whether we're going to engage in a specific community. We look at the need in the community. For us, maybe the most important thing is who are the players in that jurisdiction? Are there strong organizations? Is there really strong survivor leadership? That has to be present in order for us to engage. And then can we be impactful? In certain jurisdictions, we know the time is just not right. Not to say the time will never be right, but the time is not right. And then the opposite of that is we can look at particular situation and say, you know what, the time is right. There's a really good coalition of partners, of survivor leadership, and we feel like we can bring the work that we're doing to that jurisdiction, work in conjunction with the leaders in that jurisdiction, and we can really impact change. So we were really successful in Maine. A couple of years ago, we were able to pass the equality model in Maine. And the reason I believe we were so successful is we had Lois Reckitt, a lawmaker who's fierce and strong and super smart and was eager. And eager is maybe the understatement of the century, but to pass that legislation. But we also had really significant survivor leadership. We had some organizational support, and we had a really incredible prosecutor who was really anxious to move the needle. The other piece was that they wanted national support. And so we joined forces, we worked together, we put our ear to the ground, we really listened to the needs and wants in that particular jurisdiction. We thought about how we could provide support there. And ultimately, and it was a complete and total collaborative process with World We, with Nicosi, with Rights for Girls, with people in Maine, with the lawmaker, with the prosecutor, with the survivor community. There was just so much great collaboration that it allowed us to, using your analogy, Tom, get the ball over the
goal line
or whatever, post or whatever.
What were you working against? Like, where does the opposition come from?
Different jurisdictions have different opposition. So I'll use Oregon, for example. In Oregon, you know very well, maybe all too well, that there was a ballot initiative several years ago that was seeking to decriminalize the sex trade in its entirety. The opposition there, the person who was funding the ballot initiative, was a sex buyer who was very open about the fact that he was a sex buyer. He had tons of money. Yeah. He poured tons of money into that ballot initiative. And so sometimes that opposition comes from people like that guy.
Yeah.
I think that he had a vested interest in making Oregon a sex hub. And we had a vested interest in making sure he failed. And ultimately, we were able to crush that ballot initiative. And ultimately, we had success in Oregon.
Yeah.
So different opposition comes in different shapes and sizes, depends on the jurisdiction. But that was a hard process, wasn't it, Tom? I mean, we saw a lot of painful moments during that process. But once again, I cannot underscore the power of the survivor community that came out again and again in that particular initiative to quash that ballot initiative.
I think nobody here, and it's probably true in other parts of the country too, nobody here is under any illusions that it's not going to surface again. There's some very strong opposition to what we are advocating for, that the women and the vulnerable people in general who are exploited should never be prosecuted. I think it may have been you. It sounds like something you would say, but the victims should never be prosecuted for the crimes committed against them. And so that's one of the major tenets of the survivor, what do we call it, survivor model?
Survivor. So we've really shifted away from equality model because there was a lot of confusion about that language.
Yeah.
And we have shifted toward the survivor model because it is truly a model that represents the wants, desires, and experiences of the vast majority of survivors.
Survivors, yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, I think it's not gone away. No one has declared complete and total victory in this struggle. Can you give us an overview of where things are at now? Like let's do it this way. Where is there hopeful sign? Like Maine, like what do you see as hopeful? Where do you see it? Where does it feel more tenuous nationally?
So I feel incredibly hopeful, actually. I feel like we're in this really interesting moment in time where we've been able to sort of peel the layers back on what the survivor model does and what it doesn't do, what full decriminalization does and what it doesn't do. Yeah. And I think that people are starting to understand, we're just at the place where people are starting to understand that full decriminalization means decriminalizing not just people sold in the sex trade. Yeah, everybody wants that. But full decriminalization means decriminalizing pimps, sex buyers, and brothel owners. Yeah. And so I think to your average person, that is totally distasteful and they don't want that. So do I think we're going to see these initiatives pop up, these full decriminalization initiatives pop up? Yeah, I think we will. But I think we are having an easier time communicating to lawmakers that full decriminalization, when you look at the actual legal language, what it does is decriminalize pimps. Yeah. And when lawmakers see that, by and large, they say, no, not for me, not in my jurisdiction. Yeah. So I'm hopeful on that piece. I also feel that with Maine and with the current climate of survivor leadership, I think that we are beginning to move the needle in the direction of the survivor model. Now, I think that in certain jurisdictions, for a whole host of reasons, we won't get to the survivor model in an instant.
Right.
But I think that what we're seeing is specific jurisdictions that are sort of chipping away with legislative initiatives, with policy initiatives, building robust survivor coalitions, that we're kind of trending in the direction of getting to the survivor model.
Yeah.
And I think that what we have to sort of be honest with ourselves about is that's not going to happen overnight, especially in certain jurisdictions.
Yeah.
But I think that we are seeing a gradual movement toward people being victim-centered, understanding that criminalizing those sold in the sex trade is not the answer, that giving them exit strategies and services is.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think people are beginning to connect the dots that when we think about accountability with regard to exploiters, we can't only be talking about pimps, but we have to also be talking about sex buyers who are fueling the exploitation, right? And so we're seeing that in specific jurisdictions as well. So I feel really optimistic about where we are right now. Do I wish we could make things go faster and see more progress in a quicker way? Yeah, of course. Everybody wants that. But I am really optimistic about where we're heading.
That's so good for me to hear, because I'm prone to, at times, paralyzing cynicism. So I'm glad to hear you say it. I think it's the first time in a while I've heard you voice that, and that's encouraging. So you kind of gave us an overview of the kind of the policy landscape. You've been in this work long enough to also have a sense of the anti-trafficking movement. Like, what do you see there kind of in that long arc of people like us who come together and rally around this cause? I guess same question. What do you see that is hopeful? Where do you think we still need in the movement? Where do you think we still need to work?
So I think that the thing that makes me most hopeful is that I think 10 years ago, our movement was like still asking survivors to tell their stories. I think we have now understood that survivors are the real experts in this arena. That's one thing. Sort of the other piece of this is that we are seeing extraordinary survivors emerge as the most powerful leaders in our movement. So I'll tell you what I mean. In our legislative advocacy work, we have had a number of situations where we've actually had to go to jurisdictions and testify on particular bills. And we've seen that the survivor community has really emerged as the most persuasive testimony in the room. And I'll give you an example. So we were in one particular jurisdiction, I don't have to name it, but we were in one particular jurisdiction where there was a decriminalization effort. And World We had organized a day where a number of people, movement leaders in various capacities, lawyers, service providers, and survivors came together. They went to this particular jurisdiction and they testified against this particular bill. And what we heard from the lawmakers after the day of testimony, and there was a lot of testimony, was that they were most compelled by the survivors. One lawmaker actually apologized to our group, saying, it is terrible that survivors even have to testify to this because it's such a no-brainer. Like, why would we ever decriminalize such harmful activity? And then in the aftermath of that day, we again heard that the most powerful testimony came from the survivors in the room.
That's so good.
That's super exciting. And I think that should keep us really hopeful. The other thing, little plug for World We, is that we've created a survivor training institute called the STAND program, who your good friend, Lisa Bernard, Tom.
Another one of my really cool friends.
Her hands have been like mixing this up, and she's just done an extraordinary job. And so all of these survivors are working together. They're being trained on how to educate law enforcement and service providers.
And this is the second pillar of what you guys do. Yeah. So keep going. Yeah.
So we now have 11 survivors that have gone through a really intensive training with our World Week team and our colleagues who've come in, flown in, and done all sorts of trainings, from how to give effective testimony to how to talk to law enforcement and media training, and just the list goes on, and how to work with lawmakers. And then at the end of this training that we just had in DC a few months ago, the survivor team went to the TIP office, they went to Senator Gillibrand's office, and they went to NCMEC, and they were powerful and persuasive. And so that leaves me really hopeful. I feel really confident that with those 11 plus, right, because we're growing this program, we have an army of really well-trained powerhouse survivors who are going to shift the work dramatically.
I've had the privilege a couple times of being in those meetings when survivors speak. And I think maybe when we were together 2 years ago in DC, and yeah, there's just a whole different feel when you could have a room full of experts like you and me, and we would have things to say. But then when the survivor gets up and opens her mouth or his mouth, it's a whole different level. And I was reminded of that again. 2 weeks ago, I was at a meeting with Indigenous survivors from across Canada. It was an event, and the audience was obviously very supportive of them and what they're trying to do in Canada. But after the event, I went outside, and there was one of the women that had spoken, and she was out there, just looked like she had been hit by a truck. You could just tell. And she's out there smoking a cigarette, just trying to kind of gather herself. And I said, hi, I introduced myself. I said, this takes a toll on you, doesn't it? And she goes, yeah, it's so hard. And this is someone who has spoken before. But my point in all of that is it's costly. I don't know I'm sure you've seen this. It costs something for even a seasoned survivor to get up and tell their story. And I don't think people realize that. It's like, oh, okay, you're no longer being trafficked. Everything's good. It's just like your life must be like a Hallmark movie now that you're, completely free of this. And I'm constantly reminded of how hard it is for a survivor to continue to tell that story.
We'll be right back after these messages. Did you know we have a new show? Join us in listening to Shop Talk, an extension of the Masculine Wilderness podcast, where your host, Tom Perez, and me, your producer, Lauren Trantham, get together to talk about the behind-the-scenes action that goes on within the anti-trafficking movement, current events, and epic news. It's free to subscribe. Just head on over to our website at epicproject.org and sign up for our newsletter, and you will be automatically opted in to receive these private episodes. See you at Shop Talk. And now, back to the show.
How do you support them through that? Because I know you've thought about these things. Like, what do you need to surround them with in order to feel like they have the strength and the wherewithal to keep doing this?
So I guess I would say first, honestly, I think the survivor has to be really honest with herself about whether it makes sense for her. Like, this is not a job that every survivor has to do.
Yeah.
And actually, I think that this sort of goes to why do a lot of survivors cycle back into this work? In part because they feel deeply passionate about the issue. They want to make sure that other people do not experience the same things that they've experienced. But I also think we have to get kind of honest about why some survivors end up back in this work. And in part, some survivors end up back in this work because they have criminal convictions because of the time that when they were exploited, and they can't get other jobs.
Wow.
So that is a big red flag in our movement. Yeah. And I think we need to jump through every single hurdle that we can to overcome that. We've got to find ways to make sure that every state has vacatures to vacate those convictions so that people get to choose what kinds of jobs they want. And also, shameless plug, but like, I think that there is a huge need for federal vacatur. Huge need, because we're seeing survivors that can't get other jobs because they have federal convictions that they cannot break away from. And so they end up doing this work, even though they may be better off doing some other work.
Yeah.
Okay, so you didn't ask that question, but I answered that question. Sorry.
Can you, for the football players in the room, can you explain vacatur?
Yeah, it just simply means that very often people who have been exploited have committed a whole host of crimes as a direct result of their exploitation. And so when they get out under the thumb of a trafficker, they leave that horrific situation with criminal convictions. And those criminal convictions prevent them from being able to get a whole host of other kinds of jobs, because somebody's like running a rap sheet before they hire somebody and they see that this person has criminal convictions. And so in many states, there's a process called vacatur, which basically vacates, eliminates the criminal convictions. And then that person can ultimately be free from the criminal convictions are essentially chains that tie somebody to that exploitative situation, and it's super hard to break free from. And so we need to put legal mechanisms in place in order to get rid of those criminal convictions so that people can go on and truly move on with their lives. When we talk about employment opportunity or exit strategies and services.
Or housing, right?
Anything. I have a survivor who says that she can't even run for her kids' PTA.
Wow.
Like a position on her kids' PTA. She's been out of the life, by the way, for no less than 15 years, but she can't run for her kids' PTA president or vice president, whatever it is, because of her criminal convictions from her trafficking situation. Wow. Is so screwed up.
Yeah.
Well, we got to do better on that front.
Yeah.
But that's not the question you asked me. Should I go back to the question you asked?
You go where you want to go.
Okay.
I like it when you get wound up. So go.
Yeah. Some people like that. Some people do not. I my do. Person who's like in the office next to mine, he doesn't particularly like it when I get too wound up.
Yeah.
So the question you asked, like, what about survivors who are telling their stories? Mm-hmm. I think we also need to get away from that too. So Elisa Bernard is the other half of my brain.
Yeah.
And she's the other leader of my organization. And I actually don't think I know her story. She's a survivor. She's very open about the fact that she's a survivor. I don't know her story. I actually, if she wanted to share with me, she could share with me. But I am so just blown away by her powerful ability to advocate on the policy and legislative front.
Yeah.
And so her story, while perhaps that was what fueled her to get into this work, it's her expertise that at World Without Exploitation we rely on day in and day out. And I think we need to really sort of shift as a movement, because I think that there are so many survivors out there who have remarkable expertise and they get asked about their story, and it's not helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a helpful distinction. I just know from the non-legislative and non-survivor side of this, almost anybody I've ever met that has been kind of drawn into this work or cares about it or even supports it, like, it's the story of exploitation that is the first kind of trigger. But I think a lot of people that would otherwise be really good allies never grow past that story. It's just always an emotional response to looking at the systems and the structures that created the story in the first place. Yeah. And that kind of leads me to, the third area you talked about is the education.
Yeah, but can I just go back to one thing that you said, because it got my wheels spinning?
Yeah.
I think you're right? I think that the personal piece of this very often is what pulls people in. I don't want to pretend like that doesn't exist.
Right.
Because we're working on an issue that is so deeply personal, that like that feeling of injustice really only comes when you understand the ins and outs of this issue, right? But what I'm saying is we can get to that injustice, that feeling of like, I am enraged because somebody has lived through this. I think we can get there without asking survivors to constantly tell their stories.
Yeah, that's good.
Right?
Yeah.
So like, for example, I can tell you that as a prosecutor, sort of what pulled me in was watching women and girls who were ensnared in this exploitation. I can kind of round out what that looks like, what that experience is like. But you're hearing it from me. Yeah, I'm maybe a step removed, but I'm a firsthand account, and it's not as traumatic for me to tell.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that there are ways that we can get there and we can understand the humanity of the exploitation that happens without re-exploiting our survivors.
Yeah. But that, sadly, that is a mistake I think I've seen made over and over again in the movement. It is kind of a form of re-exploitation. I saw this 10 years ago. You referenced kind of that time frame, and what I saw was the story of survival, and that's all people wanted to hear. And that's probably where I started too. Like, that's what gripped my heart. And it has a humanizing effect, right? When you see that how this affects a real person in real time in their real life. So that's a good thing. But yeah, I think we have to see the bigger picture. And there's so many more nuances to this. And the third thing you mentioned is just community education. You're doing a lot in this way to help people understand the bigger picture. So what does that look like at World We?
You're funny. So what does it look like? I mean, it looks different every day. We have a webinar series that we've been doing since COVID. We were weekly, now we're monthly. But what we've created is a huge library of really robust conversations that range from things about legislation to recently we just did a webinar about how exploitation impacts family members, which actually came directly from something that came up at our conference where we were in an educational setting and a survivor raised her hand and said, we talk a lot about how this impacts survivors, but we don't talk about how this impacts next of kin.
Yeah.
I think that this is a piece of the conversation that we need to start having.
Yeah.
And we said, whoa, this was a blind spot for us. We're so glad you raised this, and we promise you we will go on and do something about this. And so we just had a webinar and had hundreds of people show up that day to listen to people talk about survivors and family members talk about the impact of trafficking on family members.
Yeah.
So our webinar series, that's really important.
What is that one? What is that called?
It's called Now and Next.
Now and
so
Next.
If you go to our website, you can go to our Now and Next webinar series, and you can find just a library, tons of webinars, tons of powerful speakers, really good content. And we're always looking for ideas. So if you have something that we haven't done, please shoot that over to us.
Yeah.
That's how we're always looking for new ideas to round out this conversation. So that's one thing.
Yeah.
Second, we're going into lots of different communities. We're educating law enforcement. We're educating service providers. We're educating educators. Hugely important that we educate educators right now in this critical moment in time. There was a time when I was a prosecutor where exploitation, the vast majority of coercion in terms of exploitation was happening on the street. Now, so much of it has shifted to online. And I think what that does is it makes all of our young people extraordinarily vulnerable.
Yep.
And so I think we need to meet young people where they are, and they're in schools, and their sort of frontline protectors are educators. So we need to make sure that we're getting to both educators and also young people. So that's another area that we're working in. We have a youth coalition, our World We Youth Coalition, that's doing just phenomenal work. They are powerhouses, and the youth coalition is run by young people, and it's for young people, and they're doing all kinds of advocacy work. And I know there's something I'm totally forgetting, but that's the gist. Our conference, Tom. Our conference.
I was waiting.
I
was waiting.
No, we love bringing people together in person, and we did that. We took a little bit of a break during COVID and post-COVID, and then we brought a couple hundred people together last spring in Washington, D.C., and we are going to do the same this spring.
Do you have dates?
It's about to be announced.
Okay. All right. So we'll make sure and highlight that. In terms of education, and I'm talking now not necessarily legislators, policy people, but in the general public, what are the areas that there's still some learning that needs to be done so that we can really effectively see things changed? What's the kind of the ragged edge of that educating?
I mean, I guess it depends on who you're messaging to, but I think just sort of what's fresh in my mind right now, this conversation with young people about what they perceive as really benign, OnlyFans, sugaring, all that kind of stuff that to the average young person, if you ask them, they'd be like, yeah, I know people who are on OnlyFans, or I know people who are on Seeking, and I know it's an easy way to make money. And I think we need to unpack that with young people because we're seeing a lot of harm happening on college campuses, even in high schools, deeply problematic. I think another aspect of the conversation and the education is with men and boys. I'm more hopeful about boys than I am about men, honestly. Sorry. I know this may not be like the place for that kind of a comment. But
this is exactly the place for it.
I feel really hopeful when I'm done talking to a room full of boys, because I think that the minute you connect the dots for them on all of these issues, they're like, oh yeah, buying somebody is really not okay. And here are the reasons why like they get it. And I think that we need to crack open those conversations because I think they're being inundated with messaging on social media. Like right now, we started before the conversation went live, you asked me a question and it elicited an emotional response from me. Yeah. But, I've been seeing this disgusting thing on social media, like her body, my choice forever, which is like really rampant. That messaging is really rampant. But I think that if you were to bring that message to a room full of 30, 16-year-old boys, they could give you every reason under the sun why something like that is harmful, destructive, and should stop. And so I really urge us to continue having these really important face-to-face conversations with boys who will always, always blow us away when we're face-to-face with them.
And yet what I have experienced is they're not as inclined to dismiss the influence of men. I can remember that. I can remember that as a teenager. My mom could say something to me and I would blow her off. But if my coach said the same thing to me, and it's a part of it, I think, is part of growing up. But I think it's fraught time is the phrase that comes to mind.
We're playing it nicely.
That's saying, so let's go back just a little bit. You said you have hope for boys and young men.
Can I just interject for one quick second? So the message is really important, but what you just hit on, Tom, is that the messenger is really important. So if you have a coach who is messaging healthy masculinity in a locker room, it is much more powerful than if their mom is saying it in their home, right? It's why certain educators are the most powerful messengers. It's why when sports, famous sports people come out and say bad things or political figures say bad things, it's really deeply problematic. But the reverse is true as well. Yeah. Because I think young people and young boys in particular are taking their cues from people they look up to.
Yeah.
And that's why the messages are really important and the messenger is really important.
My son-in-law is one of the head coaches, and he has all this season long has been giving a player every week a hat, and on the hat it says AFG, and it stands for Anonymous Fat Guy. It's how certain football players, myself included, refer to themselves. Like, we're the guys that if we do our job and do it well, no one ever knows our name. So just like show up and do good work. And I was at a game, and after the game, we took a picture of me surrounded by these sweaty, smelly, big guys. And it was just the most beautiful picture because they got it. Several of them came up and said, hey, man, I really appreciate what you're doing. I respect what you're doing. These are 20-year-olds that represent kind of they're the next generation of men. And they do get it. And it was my son-in-law, who's in his late 30s, early 40s. It was an older man saying these things to them, and it carries weight.
I feel like it makes me think of my own 17-year-old son, and he's got a golf coach who's just really inspiring.
Yep.
He's really just an inspiring guy. He speaks from the heart. He's really thoughtful in the way he communicates, and in direct response to the way he communicates, those boys communicate thoughtfully, respectfully, insightfully. It's just like good stuff really is contagious.
Yeah.
And so I think that especially in this really what I would call painful moment in time, I think we have to be really cognizant about what we're putting out there, because I think that will get picked up and taken by the next person.
Yeah.
And so, yes, important in my house, sure. Important in the circles I run in, sure. Really important in the place where your son-in-law works.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. I love the way you phrase it, though. That's so helpful. It's not just the message, it's the messenger. Mm-hmm. You know, and yeah, so we have to, I think as men, the challenge, and I'm not a young man anymore, but I think men in general, we have to embody something different. And that's what you're talking about, right? It's not just the words we speak. But you said, I have hope for young men, but not for old men. And
Sorry.
No, speak to that.
I mean, I shouldn't say that I have no hope for older men, but I think that we're seeing a lot. I mean, the social media piece is like, you can kind of get like pulled into the rabbit hole of your own algorithm.
Yeah.
And that's really painful and problematic. But I think that when we create spaces to have, like, I think the biggest way to combat the algorithms is by face-to-face conversations. Mm. And I think we're starting to understand that. I think we're just at the point where we're not sort of blindly going towards social media, that even amongst young people, they recognize that a lot of their feed is because of their algorithms. Yeah. And they're getting really smart and really savvy about this.
Yeah.
And so I think that it makes me really hopeful about sort of the next iteration. I think the last 5 or so years, there's been a lot of the hamster wheel and us not really thinking what we're actually experiencing. But now there's a little bit of a break free from it, where young people are starting to really get smart about what's coming in, what they're consuming, and they're recognizing there's more to this story.
Yeah.
And not just social media, but also their news and other things that they're consuming. So it does make me really hopeful. And then I think about my own 17-year-old and his world, and then the extended world. And I just think that our boys understand more than I think my generation of men did at that time.
Yeah, I watched a 17-year-old boy last year standing up in front of about 70 middle school boys, and he was talking about how it's become so normal to look at girls and women as things to be consumed. And he was I had worked with him a little bit on his presentation, and then he started riffing on this, and I'm going, we didn't talk about this, but what I remember, and it was very profound, is he looked at these kids and he said, just because it's normal doesn't mean it's right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the thing that you would have said, that I would have said, but the fact that he said it, and I spent a lot of time around middle school boys, and they were hanging on his every word. There's an authority that a young man has that's really unique, really powerful.
Well, also when you think about it sort of as the backdrop of all of this is like, yes, the algorithms, the social media, and also just the tremendous access to pornography.
Mm-hmm.
And so like if there aren't, and I think that when you like kind of dig in and you have honest conversations with boys about pornography, it's actually really complex. And a lot of boys understand how damaging it is. And girls, by the way, will say that like, if I'm like hooking up with a boy, there's an expectation that I act like a porn star.
Yeah.
And so I think we're getting to the point with young people that there's this like light bulb, there's this massive recognition that the stuff that they're being fed is deeply problematic. And so when they are given space to message the problems, the complexity, when we're not just like coming at them and being judgy and telling them, right? When we give them space to actually speak their truths, I think we get a lot more nuance, and they are really powerful messengers.
Yeah. And I think that the trick is to how do you keep nurturing that and cultivating that? And you're doing a ton in that space, which I'm really grateful for. And it's kind of inspired us for what the things that we're trying to do on this end of the country. It's funny because you came, I'm curious because you came from a really hard job into a what you could argue is
breezy job. Go ahead.
You jumped from the frying pan to the fire. You live in Florida where the weather's nice most of the time, unless there's a hurricane. So my question is, what for you at this season of life, outside of the work, what are you doing that's life-giving for you?
Life-giving or life-saving?
Take your pick. What's life-saving for you right now?
What is life-saving? I mean, I love to be outdoors. Just, I love it.
Yeah.
And I also just sort of do best when I'm like exercising, moving. It doesn't matter what I'm doing. I need to be super active.
Yeah.
And I always felt this way, Tom. It's like as a prosecutor, like the big joke was that I would like take my lunch hour and I'd go take a spin class. Not because I was like I cared so much about my body, but I just felt like for my soul, I needed it. And now more than ever, just between my job, what I see day to day, the fact that I'm raising 2 teenagers, which is maybe even harder than being a sex trafficking prosecutor in New York City, and then surviving in Florida, which is complicated in and of itself.
Yeah.
I'm finding myself taking lift classes in a hot room that's like 103 degrees. It's what I need right now.
Well, you just go outside for that. You don't need a class.
Yeah, it's hotter in that room.
Okay.
But I did say to somebody the other day, I really want to go hike the Inca Trail and like turn off the cell phone and be on a hike for 4 days somewhere that's like really physical, really rugged. And
you should put that on your list. Yeah. Well, I want to give you the last word, but I want to set up 2 scenarios for you. Okay. So imagine your kitchen. Okay. And imagine 2 conversations. And I want to know like what advice you would give to both audiences. So in your kitchen, your son and his circle of friends, and they have graduated and they're about to head off to whatever is next. What is your advice to them as a mom, as a woman who's a leader? Like, what's your charge to them? Maybe not advice.
Well, that is a really good question. What is my charge? I think it would be to be really self-reflective, create space for really open, honest conversations, and to live in a really authentic way. Probably not what you were thinking I was going to say at all.
I had three daughters, so I never had that conversation with young men.
But I think that now more than ever, it's really important that men can have open, authentic relationships with one another, because I think that will inspire them to do better by humanity.
That's great. So you kind of answered then the second audience.
Oh.
So in your kitchen, same scene, only the audience is me and Justin and Brian and Isaac and David and Gary. I'm thinking of like some of our most seasoned leaders, older guys who are in this fight. What do you say to men who are older, who want to see a better world for not just young men, but for everybody? What's your charge to us?
Keep creating spaces for younger guys. Keep creating spaces, non-judgmental spaces where we can just really listen to young people, both boys and girls. So important. And then if your third question was like, what would I say to my 14-year-old daughter? It would be, stay fierce.
I think the odds are
right now, you gotta be.
Yeah.
To navigate.
The odds are in her favor. Lauren Hersh, World Without Exploitation, World We, not WWE. You're a blessing. I'm really glad to have you as a friend in this work. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you for your conversation, for your friendship, and for your incredible work. Truly grateful for you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast with your host, Tom Perez. This podcast is a production of Epic Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to disrupting the demand for commercial sexual exploitation and dismantling the forces that perpetuate it. I'm your producer, Lauren Trantham. Special shout out to our favorite logo designer, Michelle Boucher, as well as Wes Finley, who crafted and donated our amazing theme song. Interested in sponsoring an episode? Send us an email at podcast@epicproject.org. That's podcast@epikproject.org. As a nonprofit organization, your donations allow us not only to produce this podcast and change the conversation around sexual exploitation, but also to manage our many programs, such as buyer intervention, teen prevention, and community education. Your support also allows us to support survivors of exploitation and more. To learn more about our work and to donate, visit www.epicproject.org. Once again, that is www.epikproject.org. Most importantly, this podcast would be nothing without you, the listener. Thank you for tuning in, subscribing, and sharing this episode with your friends and loved ones. Thank you for your commitment to learning more about the issues that affect our most vulnerable populations. Thank you for navigating this masculine wilderness with us. See you next episode.